Tom Bricker started the restoration in the winter of 2019, the way most men his age start projects they've been putting off for a decade. Not with a plan, but with a Saturday morning that had nothing else scheduled and a shop that had been waiting long enough. He was 66 years old. He had worked for 32 years as a civil engineer for a county road department in western Illinois and had retired the previous spring. He had a home on 5 acres outside a small town, a shop attached to the back of the garage that he had built and equipped carefully over many years, and a Massey Ferguson 35 sitting in the corner of that shop that had belonged to his grandfather and that he had been meaning to restore since his mother had asked him to take it off the family farm in 2009 when she sold the property. He had moved it, and he had covered it, and he had thought about it periodically for 10 years without doing anything about it. The Saturday morning in January of 2019, he pulled the cover off and looked at it for a while under the shop lights. Then he made coffee and came back and looked at it some more. Then he started making a list. The 35 was in the condition you would expect from a tractor that had been used hard on a working farm from the late 1950s through the mid-1980s, and then parked and largely forgotten. The sheet metal was rough in places, sound in others. The engine had not been run in years. The hydraulics would need full attention. The electrical system was the particular mystery that vintage tractor electrical systems always are. The paint was gone from most surfaces, or present only as a memory of what color had once been there. It was restorable. Tom had known that before he uncovered it. He had looked at it enough times over the years to have a general sense of what he was dealing with. What he hadn't known, until he actually started making the list, was how much he wanted to do it. He was not a man who analyzed his own motivations with much rigor. He was trained as an engineer, and he thought in terms of problems and solutions, and the question of why he wanted to restore his grandfather's tractor did not seem to him to require a complicated answer. His grandfather had owned it. His grandfather was gone. The tractor was here. Restoring it was the right thing to do with it. That was the answer he would have given if anyone had asked. Nobody did ask, particularly. Carol, his wife, understood that a retired engineer with a shop needed a project, and this was a better project than most, and she told him so. His son and daughter, both of whom lived at some distance and had limited interest in machinery, were supportive in the way of adult children who are glad a parent has found something to occupy himself. He started the work in January and found his rhythm with it by February, and by spring he had the engine apart and was making assessments. What he had not anticipated was how much the disassembly itself would hold his attention. He had restored machinery before, a small stationary engine years ago, a vintage hand drill, a few smaller things that had been more puzzle than project. The 35 was a different scale and a different category. It had been a working machine for the better part of 30 years before it was parked, and it carried that history in its components in ways that were readable if you knew what to read. The cylinder head told him the engine had run hot at some point, not catastrophically, but enough to leave marks that a careful inspection found. Someone had addressed it at some point, because the head had been resurfaced at least once, and the work was competent. He did not know when that had happened or what had caused it. He noted it and moved on. The hydraulic pump showed wear patterns consistent with heavy use in the mid-range of its operating cycle, which told him the tractor had spent most of its life doing the kind of lifting and lowering work that a small mixed farm generates. The constant attachment changes, the implement work, the hydraulic demands of a machine that serves multiple purposes through a season rather than one dedicated task. This was consistent with what he knew about Harold's operation, which had not been a single commodity farm, but the kind of diversified small farm that required a tractor to be many things on any given week. The gearbox was in better shape than he expected. The clutch had been replaced, and replaced well, at a point he estimated from the component condition was probably the late 1960s or early 1970s. Someone who knew what they were doing had done that work. He did not know if Harold had taken it to the dealer, or had had it done locally, or had done some portion of it himself. He noted the question and could not answer it. He found himself, during those early months of disassembly, paying attention to the evidence of decisions in a way he had not expected. Every repair that had been made on the machine was a decision somebody had made at a moment when something needed doing. The quality and the timing of those decisions told him something about how the machine had been owned. He was reading a record of care and practicality that spanned 20 years of someone else's working life, and the reading was slow and specific and required attention. He found it good work for a retired man with a shop in a winter. His grandfather's name was Harold Bricker, and he had farmed about 350 acres in Henderson County, Illinois, for most of his working life. He had died in 1971 when Tom was 8 years old. Tom had 6 or 7 clear memories of him. A voice, a smell of the particular combination of fuel and earth, and something else that he associated with the machine shed. Large hands, a way of moving around equipment that was unhurried and certain. The memory of sitting beside him on the 35 once, very young, going across a field for reasons Tom no longer remembered. That was approximately the total of what Tom knew about Harold Bricker in any personal sense. His mother had been Harold's daughter, and she had spoken about her father occasionally over the years, enough for Tom to have the outline of a person, but not the inside of one. Harold had been a serious farmer and a quiet man and a good neighbor, and he had died too young. That was the account Tom had been given, and he had accepted it as complete because he had no other frame of reference. Working on the tractor changed the texture of his relationship with those memories without adding anything to them. He spent hours in the shop with the machine Harold had run for 20 years, and there was something about that proximity that sharpened the outlines of the few memories he had. He noticed details on the machine that spoke to how it had been used and maintained. There were wear patterns on certain surfaces that told him something about how the tractor had been operated. There were repairs that had been made at various points, some of them professional, some of them clearly done in the field by someone who knew what he was doing but didn't have everything he needed. He looked at those field repairs and thought about the hands that had made them. He did not find this morbid or sentimental. He found it interesting in the way that evidence is interesting when you are trying to understand something. By the fall of 2020, 2 years in, he had the engine rebuilt and running, the hydraulics fully addressed, and the electrical system sorted after several months of intermittent frustration. What remained was the cosmetic work, the sheet metal, the paint, the decals, the trim pieces, the smaller parts that would make the machine look as it had looked when Harold drove it out of a dealer's lot in the late 1950s. It was the search for a specific trim piece, a chrome accent component for the hood that had been damaged beyond repair and needed replacement, that led to the phone call. Tom had been working through the network of vintage tractor part suppliers that he had built up over 2 years of restoration work, dealers who specialized in older machines, individuals who had parts collections accumulated over decades, online marketplaces where the inventory was unpredictable, but occasionally exactly right. He had found most of what he needed through this network, but the chrome piece was proving difficult. It was specific to the 35 in a particular year range and had not been reproduced and was not common in the parts market. He had a name passed to him by another restorer he had connected with through an online forum, a man in his 80s in central Iowa named Everett Marsh, who had been dealing in vintage Massey Ferguson parts since the 1970s and who was said to have inventory that didn't appear anywhere public because he had never found the internet particularly relevant to the way he did business. Tom was given a phone number and told that Everett would talk to you if he felt like it and wouldn't if he didn't, and that the best approach was to call during morning hours and explain clearly what you were looking for. Tom called on a Tuesday morning in October. Everett picked up on the third ring. He had a voice that placed him accurately in his 80s, deliberate, slightly thin, but with the particular quality of a man who had spent most of his life talking to other people about things he understood thoroughly. Tom explained what he was looking for, giving the year range and the specific component and the application. Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought he had one. He said he would need to go look, and that looking would require him to go out to the parts building, and that Tom should call back in the afternoon. Tom said he appreciated it and would call back after 2. Everett said, "You said a Massey Ferguson 35. What year exactly?" Tom gave him the year. Everett said, "Where'd you get it?" Tom said it had belonged to his grandfather, who had farmed in Henderson County, Illinois. There was a pause on the line. Everett said, "What was your grandfather's name?" Tom told him. The pause this time was longer. Everett said, "Harold Bricker farmed out near Biggsville." Tom said yes, that was right. Everett said, "I knew Harold Bricker." The afternoon call lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Tom sat at his workbench with the shop lights on and the 35 in the corner behind him and listened to an 83-year-old man in Iowa talk about his grandfather. Everett Marsh had been a parts and service manager at a Massey Ferguson dealership in Iowa that had covered territory on both sides of the Illinois state line in the late 1950s and through the 1960s. Harold Bricker had been a customer of that dealership, had bought the 35 there, had brought his service work there, had been one of the accounts Everett managed for the better part of a decade before Harold's death in 1971. He had known him in the way that a service manager knows a long-term customer for approximately 12 years. He talked about Harold in the specific way of a man recalling someone he had actually known rather than someone he was being asked to describe. He remembered the 35 purchase because Harold had come in with a list of questions written out on a piece of paper and had asked every one of them before he signed anything, which Everett said was not how most farmers operated, and which he had respected. He remembered Harold bringing the tractor in for its first service and pointing out a small issue with a hydraulic fitting that Everett's shop had subsequently found on 3 other units from the same production run. He remembered Harold as someone who paid attention and who reported accurately. He talked about Harold's farming operation with the familiarity of someone who had heard it discussed over years of service counter conversations. The ground was difficult in places. Parts of Henderson County ran to heavy clay that was hard on equipment and hard to work in wet conditions. Harold had figured out the specific approach that worked for his ground, and he ran it consistently and didn't change things without a reason. Everett said Harold was not a man who complained. He said in 12 years of dealing with him, he had never heard Harold complain about prices or weather or neighbors or government or any of the ordinary subjects that service counter conversation in that period ran to. He said Harold came in, said what he needed, listened to what Everett told him, made his decision, and left. He said that after a while, you noticed the absence of complaint in a person, and it told you something about how they were built. Tom sat very still during this part of the conversation. He was hearing a description of a person that confirmed the outline he had been given as a child, while filling in the interior of it in a way he had not expected and had not prepared for. Tom had been taking notes during the call without fully realizing he was doing it. He had a legal pad on the workbench beside the phone, and by the time Everett had been talking for an hour and a half, he had covered 3 pages in the handwriting he used when he was writing fast and not thinking about penmanship. He asked Everett if he remembered anything else. He said it in a way that he hoped did not sound like what it was, which was a grandson trying to collect everything available about a man he had lost before he was old enough to know him. Everett said he remembered that Harold had a habit, when he was waiting at the service counter while work was being done, of walking the shop floor if anyone invited him to, and looking at the other machines in for service, and occasionally asking a question about something he saw that he didn't recognize or understand. He said Harold had been interested in equipment beyond his own and had a mechanic's curiosity about how things worked, even when they weren't his problem. Everett said he had always appreciated that because most farmers came in and sat in the waiting area and looked at the wall. Harold had been someone you could show something to. He said Harold had also been the customer who, on 2 separate occasions over the years, had brought back a loaner machine and mentioned something small that he had noticed during use. Not a complaint, just an observation that turned out both times to be useful diagnostic information about the loaner's condition. Everett said he had started to expect it from him. He said that kind of attention was not common. Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll tell you something I remember clearly." He said that in the summer of 1968, Harold had come in for a service on the 35 and had brought his daughter with him. He said she had been a teenager, maybe 15 or 16. He said Harold had walked her through the service process, not the mechanics specifically, but the relationship side of it, why you use the same dealer over time, what a service record means, why you pay attention to what a mechanic tells you even when you don't follow all of it. He said Harold had been teaching her something about how you handle the business side of farming. Tom's mother had been 16 in 1968. He did not say anything for a moment. Everett seemed to understand that and waited. Tom asked if the part was findable. Everett said he would go look in the morning. The chrome piece was in Everett's parts building, in the original condition, in a box with 3 others of the same component. Everett sold Tom one at a price that was fair by any measure, and that Tom suspected was lower than it should have been. They had spoken twice more after that, shorter calls, following up on a couple of smaller items that Everett thought he might have and did have. The conversations had been mostly practical. But at the end of the second call, Everett had said, without particular ceremony, that Harold Bricker had been a good customer and a decent man, and that it was good to know the tractor was going to someone who was taking care of it. Tom had thanked him, and meant it in a way that was difficult to express briefly over the phone. He finished the restoration in the spring of 2021. The 35 came out the way a careful restoration comes out when the man doing it has taken his time and not cut corners. Not a show trailer machine, not a trailer queen that had never seen field work, but a tractor that looked as it had looked when it was new, while also looking like something that had been built to work. He started it in the shop on an April morning and let it run for a while and listened to it. Carol came out and looked at it and said it was beautiful, and he said he thought it was pretty good. He did not tell her right then about the phone call and Everett and what he had learned. He told her some of it that evening, and more of it over the following weeks, in the pieces he had been turning over in his mind since October. She asked him how it changed the way he thought about the project. He said he wasn't sure it changed it exactly. He said he had started the restoration because it was the right thing to do with the tractor his grandfather had left behind. He still thought that, but he had started it thinking he was restoring a machine, and somewhere around a 3-hour phone call with an 83-year-old parts dealer in Iowa, he had understood that he was also trying to know someone he had never had enough time to know. He said the phone call had given him more of that than he had expected to find. Carol said that was a good thing. He said yes. He said he thought it was a very good thing, and that he was glad the chrome piece had been hard to find. The 35 sat in the shop for another season while Tom decided what to do with it. He used it occasionally for work on the property, light tasks, the kind the machine was built for, and found that it ran well and that running it was a different experience than he had anticipated. Not emotional in a way he had braced for, just present. The machine existed and functioned and had a history, and he was now a part of that history in a way he had not been when it was sitting under a cover in the corner. He drove it out to where his mother lived in the summer of 2021. She was 89 and in an assisted living facility and had been told he was coming. He pulled the trailer into the parking lot, and she came out with a walker and someone from the staff, and she stood beside the tractor for a while without saying much. She said it looked like it used to. He said that was the idea. She put her hand on the hood, the way you put your hand on something that connects to something else, and stood there for a moment. He told her about Everett Marsh. He told her about the conversation in October. He told her what Everett had remembered about the summer of 1968, about Harold bringing his daughter to the service counter and walking her through how the business side of farming worked. His mother was quiet. Then she said she remembered that day, She said she hadn't thought about it in 50 years. She said her father had told her on the way home that a farmer's relationship with his dealer was one of the most important relationships in the operation, and that you maintained it by being consistent and by being honest and by paying on time. She said that had been a Harold Bricker kind of lesson. Tom said that was exactly how Everett had described it. She looked at the tractor for another moment and then said she was getting cold and needed to go back inside. He helped her back to the entrance. At the door, she turned and looked at the 35 on the trailer in the parking lot and said, "You did a good job on it." He said he had tried to. She went inside. He stood in the parking lot for a moment looking at the machine his grandfather had bought the year before his mother turned 17, and thought about a man he had 6 memories of and had spent 3 years trying to know a little better. He thought he had gotten somewhere. Not all the way. You never get all the way with a person who has been gone for 50 years, but somewhere. He drove home and backed the trailer into the shop and unloaded the 35 and parked it where it had been. He had not decided yet whether to sell it or keep it or find some other arrangement. He was not in a hurry to decide. The machine had waited 10 years while he figured out he was ready to work on it. It could wait a little longer while he figured out what came next.